All right, this is Professor Wham, and we are going to commence with Part 2 of Project Identification, subtitled Phase 1, Weird Photos, Unnerving Aircraft, and Cunning Lights. Now, I wanted to start this with a picture here of Clark's Mountain, which is near Piedmont, Missouri. I have not been able to find a picture of Piles Mountain, no matter where I've looked. So either it's called something else now officially, or no one has bothered to take a photo of it that is on the internet. Anyway, I wanted to give an indication of what the topography was like down in southern Missouri. And that's just to give a sense of it, and also to again answer one of the unfortunate comments that was made by one of the podcasters in that second podcast that I mentioned in part 1. In addition to making fun of Mr. Bone, they also made fun of Missouri. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Missouri in terms of its politics, but one of the podcasters made the comment of, well, I've driven through Missouri and it's not that interesting. And the truth is that I lived in Missouri for a long time, and I will agree that driving the St. Louis to Kansas City corridor on I-70 is not the most scintillating thing in the world. However, that is not all of Missouri. Southern Missouri is home of the Ozarks, and the Ozarks are a mountain orogeny that is older than the Appalachians. It's one of the oldest mountain orogenies in the Americas, and it has a long and storied history of people living there. It's a very interesting place, and it's beautiful. It's also kind of creepy, as I indicated in part 1. I mean, I've been to the Ozarks. I've camped in the Ozarks, both on the Missouri and Arkansas side, and it's beautiful and it's creepy. It's old. You can tell that it's really old. The Ozarks proper were the home base for the Osage Nation, who I mentioned in part 1 but didn't talk about very much. I just wanted to mention them a little bit again. They consider the Ozarks to kind of be their birthplace, the place where they as a nation originated, even though linguistically they are related to Northern Plains peoples like the Lakota. They're basically the same language family. But the Osage people have lived in the Ozark region for so long that they kind of consider it to be home. Various members of their nation participated in some of the city building, what we can now call the mound building cultures, Hopewell and Mississippian, that grew up to the east and west, actually, of the Ozarks. They participated in that, but they also maintained their own identity. And when those civilizations began to collapse, the last city, I think, on the eastern side was populated. I think it was abandoned in the early 15th century, like about 1420 or something. The Osage people withdrew back into the mountains and used the mountains as their base of operation. They basically would travel east to the Mississippi to trade, and then they would go out west to the plains, to what is now Kansas and Oklahoma, and they would hunt buffalo there, and then they'd finish their hunting and they would withdraw back to these mountains. The mountains are kind of like their fortress, they're the place where they felt safest. And it took a little bit of doing to push them out of that. Now most of them live in Oklahoma, but they remember their life in the Ozarks, and some of them have remained. They have figured out ways of going back and remaining. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Osage people, because people tend to forget who they are. We've heard of the Osage, but we don't really know that they are actually a nation, and that this is where they lived. So we're at the beginning of phase 1 of project identification, and the field work for project identification officially began on May 21st, 1973, after the college spring session had ended and before summer school commenced. By then, funding from that St. Louis newspaper had been procured. Rutledge had assembled his team more or less. He had reserved motel space and was more or less ready to go. And they were going to use this motel space not only to sleep in, they rented 2 adjoined rooms, but they also were going to store extra equipment in there and test the equipment out. His last reconnaissance mission to Piedmont should have been a clue that the trip would be more interesting than they could have imagined. He had planned on a 3-week effort, which would enable the team to gather data that then could be analyzed later in the summer. He did expect some complications, but it got very interesting. So his last reconnaissance mission was on May 18th, 1973. Rutledge had decided to go back one more time beforehand because they had seen a bunch of stuff. He had seen a bunch of stuff, like maybe a dozen sightings of these mysterious lights, but he hadn't really gotten pictures of anything. They hadn't really actually recorded anything in the field. So he picked up 2 buddies, John and Bob Adams, and the trio set out. They had Pyle's Mountain in mind and as their observation point. And that's because there's a nice concrete slab up there that you can set your equipment on. It was a concrete slab. It wasn't built to be intended to be used that way, but it's since become sort of an observation point. And you'd set your stuff out there and just observe. The 3 of them had probably over a dozen various cameras and binoculars between them, and they set up on a concrete slab, on this concrete slab that was used by anyone. So John saw the amber light first. They had been shooting the breeze with a couple who had also arrived on the mountain in the hopes of seeing something. The light came from the southeast, above the tree line, and seemed to be coming in pretty much at the group directly, perpendicular to the line of trees in front of them. Rutledge, Bob, and John began to take various time exposures of the light, using almost all their cameras in succession. And this is a nice diagram that Rutledge has provided in his book that basically shows this. You have the concrete slab where everybody is kind of looking. They see this amber light that's approaching them. You see these line of trees right here. There's also a Polaroid camera that was used a little bit closer here at a tree right at this spot here that they kind of ran up. One of them ran up to be able to try to get a little bit closer to the light. So as soon as they started taking pictures, the light suddenly began to move away from them, along and just above the tree line. It was relatively close, probably less than 5 miles away, although they couldn't be sure of that. That was an estimate. They couldn't triangulate anything because there wasn't a second station of observers. And it was just above the tree line, maybe about 80 feet up, and completely silent. The turn of this object was made instantaneously, without seeming hesitation or inertia, and depending on distance, they were later able to calculate that the distance was between 166 to 330 miles per hour, depending on how far it was. Everyone was able to get some shots of the light before it disappeared into the growing darkness. Now, the consternation came when the film was developed. All in all, 5 good exposures were obtained, yet none of the photographic plates showed the same pattern. All were time-lapse. And there was a significant difference between what Bob was able to observe through his high-powered binoculars. What he saw, basically, what everybody saw with their naked eye, was just an amber light, kind of an undifferentiated amber light. But what he saw when he looked through his binoculars is what is on the right here. He saw this kind of spinning object that was changing light, had these light shifts in it. And then there was a difference between that and then what the photographs actually recorded. For example, and if you're actually watching the video, I can show you this because I have it up here on a slide in the upper left-hand corner. And this, keep in mind, the light is moving from the right to the left. So that's, you know, they took these photos as the light was moving away from them after it had made that turn. So this exposure here at the top was taken with Kodachrome ASA 64 film, and it showed largely what one might expect of a time-lapse photo of a nocturnal light. There's basically a semi-solid line, although it exhibited an interesting color variation in the lower trail section of the line, which you can't see here because they used color stock, but then reproduced it for the book in black and white, so you can't really tell that. However, the very same light, taken at the same time by a different camera with a longer exposure using Kodak 2475 ASA 1000 film, showed instead a pattern of discrete lights that appeared to jump around a bit as the light progressed. If anything, the solid line given this particular type of film should have been more distinct, but instead was less. There were several other anomalies in the photos, which Rutledge goes into great technical detail to explain, some of which might be lost on individuals who do not or no longer understand the specifics of different camera and film, which I'm one of those people. They did account for lens flare and other potential artifacts. And these are also some of the plates that were taken. And again, keep in mind that, and these were with other cameras and other film, keep in mind that the light is moving. I think this is the Polaroid. Yeah, this is from the Polaroid that one of them ran forward with a Polaroid and began to take pictures of it that way. And to remind you, the object is moving, or the light is moving from right to left. So you're seeing it as it's moving away, basically. As the light moved away from them, the photos appeared to show the light jiggling in a manner, and you can see this here in this other photo at the very bottom in the lower left. It appears to jiggle in a manner that was completely undetectable to the naked eye, but might be very familiar to individuals who have seen the photos of Dorothy Wilkinson Izat or have tried to photograph close nocturnal lights in Pine Bush, New York. In fact, a lot of Pine Bush, New York nocturnal lights, if people try to photograph them, they do exactly pretty much the same thing. The photographic evidence was so unusual that Rutledge spends an entire chapter describing the whole story, including minute analysis of several photos in the process. The other thing that I wanted to include here, and this is what is on the right side, and you can't really see this clearly here, but if you look in this lower left photo to the very, very far edge of the photo, you'll notice this little tiny funny anomaly here, and this anomaly is what is blown up on the right. The reason that Rutledge does this, and he talks about it extensively in his book, there's a lot of technical stuff he talks about, is that this anomaly, this flare, should not be there. This type of flare only occurs on photographic plates using film of this kind under certain very specific conditions. And they could not explain it. He actually took this photo to other photographic experts, and they could not explain why this anomaly occurs. And, you know, of course, those of us looking at this now think it's really interesting that this anomaly occurs right as the object is moving out of frame. You know, it's kind of interesting, but it apparently is a type of energy discharge that only imprints itself on photographic plates, again, under certain circumstances. So it represents a kind of energy, a kind of light energy. And keep in mind that none of this was visible to the naked eye. So this is being picked up by photographic film. So they didn't even know what they were looking at until they actually developed the film. So given this experience And in an optimistic mood, Rutledge called the opening phase of project identification Operation Intercept. And this was going to begin, as I mentioned, on Monday, May 21st, 1973, and they were going to be in the field for 3 weeks. The first 3 days, which entailed setting this team up, establishing responsibilities, and various reporting procedures, didn't go as planned. Although some interesting initial sightings were made, various logistical issues, such as a bizarre miscommunication on the part of someone somewhere on their use of a particular local airfield, made it difficult for the team to really get anything substantive done. In fact, when you're reading now, it kind of sounds like, Mercury retrograde descended on the entire team. It's like every possible weird communication that could go wrong does. It's just weird. They don't really have mechanical problems or equipment problems. It's more like people issues, which was kind of frustrating for him because he had spent some time in the, going to Piedmont, going to Farmington, going to some of these areas and trying to let officials know that they were going to be there. And then all of a sudden there were these weird communication snafus. Anyway, days 4 and 5 yielded the best results for the team overall, but the sightings were particularly unnerving and unexpected. Observer stations were set up in 2 locations in Piedmont, one in Farmington, one at Williamsville, and one at Sam A. Baker State Park, so there was good deployment in the field. Rutledge decided to travel to Farmington and set up with a colleague on a small local airstrip outside of town. They watched and identified various small aircraft come and go. At 9:21, an unidentified amber light switched on as soon as a small aircraft associated with the area disappeared. They began taking pictures. A random person approached in a car with headlights on, and they got the person to turn them off. In fact, there was this whole thing of them, he basically said this person turned on with their headlights on, and they ran up to them to say, turn this off, turn this off, turn this off. Another small plane approached, and the amber light went off. When it had passed, the amber light came on again. The amber light made no sound. And these are exposures that they took of this amber light. One is taken, they used a couple of different cameras, but the camera that he most emphasizes is the Kodak Tri-X ASA 800 film. And you can see here that this amber light has energy just discharges all over the place. And they spent a great deal of time trying to analyze what these discharges could be. And keep in mind that this is an amber light that is periodically stationary and periodically moving a little bit, and none of what you're seeing here on the photographic plate is seen by the naked eye. So this is the picture that this light is taking, essentially. However, this was not the weird thing that occurred. At this point, and they're taking pictures of this amber light, at this point, Rutledge reported that he saw something very strange. He noticed that the night was very still, except for the sound of children playing in the distance. Although his attention was focused on the amber light, he suddenly had an impulse to look straight up, directly over his head. And there he saw 4 lights, red and white, that were obviously attached to a massive aircraft that was passing silently overhead. The lights were in no known configuration and seemed to be attached to a great V-shaped wing. And so he pulled out his binoculars, and this is what he saw. Using binoculars, he saw these 4 lights in this configuration. They were clearly attached to a wing that he could tell by the nature of their deployment as it was a steeply curved wing, but he could not clearly see hardly anything else of the aircraft. He used these binoculars, and he was able to see a ribbed or raised structure that was attached to the rear end of the craft. But it was so large, the craft itself, and here on the right, this is from 2 pages of his book, And this is a drawing that he made of this ribbed structure. But it was so large overall that he could not actually see the whole thing. The lights appeared to be on only one wing and didn't reflect in any way off the surface of the object. In fact, no lights, even from the town, reflected off the object. He could only just sort of see the outline of this massive, massive object. Now, the cloud ceiling was only about 2,500 feet. And doing some quick calculations, Rutledge determined that given the dimensions he observed, the aircraft would have had to have been anywhere from 368 feet to a half mile across, depending on its altitude under the cloud ceiling. And keep in mind that 368 feet is much, much larger. It's almost 100 feet longer than a football field. So this is a massive, massive craft, whatever it is. This was definitely a Class A sighting. His colleagues saw the four lights in formation, but was unsure of their deployment on the wing of the craft. So he didn't actually see them necessarily deployed in the same way that Rutledge did. In fact, I believe, if I remember correctly, he actually saw them in a different order. So he didn't see exactly what Rutledge saw. And the simple amber light, which started all of this, was forgotten. However, once the two got back into the car, they were to observe yet another xenon-colored light. And to remind you, xenon is kind of a really bright, vibrant blue-white light that appeared to jump from side to side when viewed with binoculars. So they saw this other light. It looked just like a light, but then when you held binoculars up and looked at it, it appeared to jump from side to side. So the movement wasn't apparent with the naked eye, but only through binoculars. Now, when the duo returned to Piedmont, they found that the observers there had not only tracked a nocturnal light, but had managed to successfully triangulate it more precisely. And these are the measurements that they were able to get. This is what being able to triangulate will do for you. It had approached the team's position on Piles Mountain at 207 miles per hour, passing within a quarter mile of their location, and had blinked off 310 feet above them. 5 minutes later, it had blinked on again. It was 300 feet higher than that, and slowly drifted to the northeast, ascending to 1,500 feet before it disappeared. Their radio equipment had registered static for the duration of the sighting. Now, day 5 brought more mysteries. Rutledge returned to Farmington, taking more members of the team with him so that they could set up in 2 locations there. Over the course of the evening, observers witnessed lights on another large silent craft that couldn't be identified. They were constantly identifying other aircraft and satellites in order to rule them out. So they spent a lot of time talking about that. They also saw strobe flashes and triangular formations of lights. In one instance, he and his colleague observed strange lights flying over the other Farmington team, which the latter never saw. More photos with strange effects were taken. Now, on the left of this slide, I just simply duplicate a comparison set that Rutledge reproduces in his inset of photographs in the book. And on the top left, you have another plate of that silly amber-colored wiggling light. And what he's doing is he's comparing it to a time lapse of the moon on the bottom left. And this is just to show the difference between these two. That if you have a stationary object like the moon obviously isn't really stationary, but if you have a stationary object like the moon, or you have from your perspective, a more slow-moving conventional object, say that of aircraft, and you do time-lapse of it, you're going to get these straight lines like this. And that's normal. That's what a time-lapse will show. You're not going to get this jiggly stuff, which is generally indicative of energy discharges of a certain type. During the evening of day 5, the Piedmont observers were able to procure additional triangulation on another light, which approached them on Piles Mountain, even though one of the additional stations that they'd hoped to use in another location had been vandalized and destroyed. And they had tried to use a location called Mud Lick Mountain. I love those southern names, Mud Lick Mountain. But they had set up this antenna, and the purpose of this antenna was not only to help them use this as an observation station, but it was intended to help with the radio transmissions and the walkie-talkie transmissions. But somebody had gone up there and vandalized and destroyed that station, and had actually stolen the wiring for the antenna up there, so they were unable to use it. But they still were able to triangulate this next light on day 5 or evening 5. In this instance, an unidentified nocturnal light approached their location. Having traveled south at 310 miles an hour, it turned toward them, sped up to 325 miles per hour before turning again to the southwest and blinking out. In this instance, Jim Drake, who was actually in his airplane at the time, had actually seen this light from the air, from his airplane, and he attempted to communicate with the ground because he was going to chase it, but they had radio interference. Now, upon further investigation, the Piedmont team was able to determine that the kind of radio interference that they had encountered was actually produced by jamming technology. It was not naturally occurring. The radio equipment that they had these oscillators on them that when the oscillators went into certain kinds of ranges or acted in certain ways, they were able to determine that these frequencies were being caused by some kind of deliberate interference. So there was a deliberate jamming of their radio equipment that was being done by someone or something. It was also during that evening that 2 other members of the team, located in other stations, also experienced pseudostar sightings as well. And to remind you what a pseudostar is, that's when there's a light that's in the sky that is pretending, you don't know it at first, but is pretending to be part of a constellation or a planet or something like that. And you go, why is that there? And then all of a sudden it moves, or it gets bright, changes color, does something, revealing that it is not in fact part of this constellation, but was just fooling you to get you to look at it. Or that's what it seems like. That's what it seemed like eventually to the team members. Not yet at this point in phase 1, but that's sort of what it seemed like to them later. So although having started out poorly, week 1 of project identification had ended well, and the whole team looked forward to spending another 2 weeks in the field. There was already plenty of data to analyze, and almost everyone on the team had seen at least one really odd thing. Unbeknownst to them, this would be the only full week of field investigation in the Piedmont area. The second week would be filled with tribulation, terrible weather, and stories. It was as if an ineffable deluge had decided to engulf the area quite suddenly. The team found itself dodging torrential rains, truly dangerous flash floods, and even narrowly missed driving into a tornado. In addition, the team experienced technical issues, not only with their equipment, but with their main vehicle. They were using a car that was loaned to them by the college. They lost a muffler somewhere somehow, and they had 2 flat tires. To try to compensate for their inability to set up observing stations, Rutledge and his team, those who stayed behind because he had sent some of them home, decided to collect various UFO accounts from the area in order to get further information and context. And there were many to be found, including the stories of a local named Floyd White, who claimed to have seen so many unusual lights that he had fitted up his property with many antennae to try and hone in on them. He was kind of one of the characters that they observed and interviewed. But apparently his sightings were well within the norm. He just had a lot of them. Now, in order to be as complete as possible, Rutledge also stopped by the house of Coach Reggie Bone and found him to be a quiet, generous, and well-spoken person, quite different than the media portrayed him. He recorded Bone's account for the sake of completeness, and there is a version here that I will read from you. And this is actually from the old MUFON site that as it has been archived by Weebly. Thank God for Weebly. And this was actually from the official MUFON report that was put together. The initial investigation was done by an organization. What was the organization called? Let's see here. The International UFO Bureau of Oklahoma City did the initial investigation of Bones' story, and they were able to determine various things. They went to the actual site where the sighting took place, and they created this first report and then gave it to MUFON. They disbanded in the late 70s, and when MUFON, somebody kept their archives, and then when MUFON was established, they moved all of their information to MUFON. So this is a version of what Reggie Bones saw. This is actually not from the newspaper. This is from a report that he gave to this UFO organization. And it is different than the entire report that he gave to Rutledge, which Rutledge has never released. It was never released, to my knowledge. I don't know whether it's one of those archived things or not. But anyway, I've already given you the background to this, and just to remind you, Coach Bone was traveling with 2 team managers and 3 of his players along Highway 60 near Ellisnore, Missouri, which is about 20 miles south of Piedmont. They were feeling kind of crappy because they'd lost this crucial tournament by 7 points, so they were rehashing their failures. And suddenly Bone, who was driving, noticed a bright shaft of light beaming down out of the sky. So he saw a strobe, basically. That's what a strobe is. A few miles later, as the car passed through the Brushy Creek area, and the Brushy Creek area would be one of the places that in later phases of Project Identify, when they would go back to the Piedmont area, they would set up around the Brushy Creek area. There were a lot of sightings there. So as they were passing through this area, the player Randall Holmes noticed something else. "Look," he shouted, "there's that thing we saw back on Highway 60. Bone pulled over to the side of the road, and the 6 piled out, and then this is what Bone says. "It looked like it was about 200 yards off the road, hovering over an open field." And investigators from the International UFO Bureau of Oklahoma City later estimated the object was probably about 400 feet above the ground. "It was impossible to determine the size or shape," said Mr. Bone, "because of the darkness. Anyway, we saw 4 lights that looked like portholes, red, green, amber, and white. We figured they were about 3 or 4 feet apart, all in a row." And then Carrie Banks, who was another witness, said, "We just stood there and watched it for about 10 minutes. Then all of a sudden the lights went directly up into the air with absolutely no noise, and then just disappeared over a hill." So that was their sighting, and apparently it kind of freaked them out. It was very startling, but they saw it for a period of time. Now, what is interesting about the porthole thing is that later on in Project Identification, closer to home, Rutledge is going to see something very similar. He's going to see very suddenly what appears to be 4 amber, whitish lights that are shaped very much like portholes. In other words, they're not round. They are sort of rectangular, kind of like portholes or windows would be, but they're not attached to any object. They just suddenly appear like that, and he watches for a little bit, and then they wink out one by one. So this is a sighting that's very similar to something that Rutledge is going to see later on. It's just that the colors are different. And I, of course, will include the link to this particular report from Weebly in the description section of both the both of the blog and the vlog. There were a couple of indeterminate sightings later in week 2 during periods when the weather temporarily cleared. One was of the random flashlight effect, which is a version of the strobing that Rutledge witnessed through binoculars from one of their viewing stations. He didn't have camera equipment with him. And on the right is his diagram of this sighting. Basically, what he saw is one light come on, and this is a version of the flashlight strobing effect, or the random flashlight effect. You have a light come on, and that causes you to look. You look, and as soon as you look, there are all these little lights on the side that begin flashing at you. In these sort of what appears to be a random pattern. Now, during this same time period, another complex sighting was initiated by James Drake, the Cessna pilot, who had flown in during the one relatively calm evening that week to see if he might be able to help. After landing, the remaining team members did some sky watching, and Drake did see an amber light in the distance blink on. So Rutledge and Drake ran to the Cessna and took off. They were never able to re-find that specific amber light. But Rutledge viewed and was able to make record of several lights that appeared in various guises around them, including one as a pseudostar and another which they were able to chase for a time. It brightened and dimmed as they approached and moved away, always keeping ahead of them. Now, interestingly, team members on the ground never saw these specific lights that Drake and Rutledge saw, but were only able to pick up separate and coming from different directions aircraft with clearly identifiable FAA lighting. Nothing that Rutledge saw in the Cessna displayed any regulation lighting, despite his studious attempts to check for that. And that's one thing that he does repeatedly in this book, is when they see different types of lighting, different types of craft or lights, especially if there are aircraft about, he will continuously call aircraft control, the various aircraft control towers. He calls the military. He calls individuals who run local airports. He's trying to figure out if anybody is flying non-regulation craft in the air. And of course, he's always getting negative answers. So none of that helps at all. In many ways, the second week was a complete bust. There had been virtually no time to prepare team members in the field, because of the weather. And so it was very, very difficult for them to figure out what equipment to get out when. You have to remember this equipment was very vulnerable to weather and to wet and to humidity. And the motel room that they kept, not only to sleep in, but to store that extra equipment, was costing them $100 a day. So they were kind of going through that money that had been given to them by the newspaper. And in 1973, that was pretty expensive, much more expensive than it is now. So at the end of the second week, Rutledge decided to call a halt to the Piedmont field search, since according to the Weather Service, it appeared as if the terrible weather would continue. Now, although all team members actually witnessed unidentified lights that week, all such observations occurred under conditions that rendered it almost impossible for the phenomenon to be photographed, filmed, or otherwise permanently recorded. Now, he doesn't make any note of that specifically himself. It's not like it doesn't occur to him, but for those of us who are familiar with these kinds of phenomena, this is interesting. The first week, the team manages to get and record very specifically a variety of lights doing different things, and to record what they're doing and how they're moving. The second week, the weather changes. It's terrible. Everybody sees stuff, but nobody can record anything. It's just interesting, and that's all I'll say. But there was another reason to go back home. According to what Rutledge was learning from his team colleagues who had returned from the field, UFOs were beginning to be reported around Cape Girardeau itself. As we say in the business, the lights had followed him home. Phase 2 of project identification would commence soon. So this is the end of part 2, project identification.